Well guys, it's time to combat the most amazing discussion of all, ideological theory on an iceberg chart. There are so many political ideologies it would be hard trying to cover them all, so instead of looking around trying to find random ones, I've chosen to tackle an iceberg I found online by Reddit user Sector Preza. There's definitely a lot to cover here. Keep in mind I'm no expert on political theory, I'm more of a novice at it, but I'll be as fair as possible covering these ideologies and finding balanced sources. Also, there are differences in every ideology, not every one of them is the same. Also, and I'm going to stress this, take these as brief descriptions of each ideology, not an end-all list of a philosophy. Seriously, read into these if you're interested. Once again, I'm not an expert here, and I highly advise you do your own research. You may not know who I am, so you may be a little cautious to subscribe, and that's a-okay. Make sure to watch the video to the end, and decide whether or not you would like to subscribe or not. Either way, I appreciate you watching. Anyways, let's get right into this. Here is the Ideological Iceberg Explained. Apoliticism. You are not involved. You either do not care about ideology or just merely despise it all. Conservatism. Associated with the Republican Party in the United States, it is a commitment of traditional values and institutions. There are many variants, but the basic idea is to oppose the idea of modernism. You may be wondering, what makes a conservative a conservative? Well, it's really considered whatever the values and customs are at a given time and where the conservative is geographically. A conservative located in Canada can be different from one located in the United States. Really, conservatism can be extreme as it wants to be, or as feeble as it wants to be. Take your pick. Liberalism. Founded on the ideas of liberty and equality, it encourages freedom of press, religion, speech, and free markets, basic components of the Constitution of the United States. It's also a big proponent of individuals' rights, including civil and human rights. It became popular during the era of Enlightenment, when philosophers such as John Locke argued its key components in rejection to the absolute monarch. Following the American and French Revolution, liberalism continued to expand across the globe, and to this day is still fairly popular. Capitalism. A country's profit is owned by private industries rather than the state controlling it. It's big on property rights and competitive markets that lead to incentive to create, meaning that innovation is about due to capitalism. However, capitalism has led to its fair share of criticisms, with those arguing that it concentrates way too much power to private company owners, and that it exploits the working class. The idea is that profit is held above people and environment. This can lead to mass corruption. It's all a big debate, however every time I hear the word capitalism, I always think about Scrooge McDuck. Anyone else think about that? Centrism. Most centrists, and I'm saying most here because there are radical centrists, are against rapid political shifts. They're a little more rare, and those who label themselves try to be as balanced and reasonable as possible. It is neither too liberal or conservative. It also gets a lot of despisement from both sides, with it being often memed on. Anarchism. It is the complete abolition of the government and the importance of individual liberty. In its most basic sense, it disdains the state and advertises the idea of being freely constituted. In the media, it is depicted as a complete collapse of society, but anarchists would like to inform you otherwise. They instead see a paradise of free and voluntary people. Socialism. The idea of having the means of production and distribution exchanged and regulated by the people as a whole. It encompasses a whole entire range of qualities that depend on how radical or unradical it wants to be. Despite all of this, social ownership is the main quality of socialism. It's about how far the government should intervene in its regulation of supplies and in its institutions. Today it is seeing a resurgence and a strike of popularity within the United States. Perhaps we may see a more socialist United States in the coming decades. Neo-Conservatism. Yep, a key example of this ideology is found within former President George W. Bush's foreign policy. It promotes an idea of democracy via interventionism in international affairs. Using the means of military force and a disdain for opposing ideologies, the process of neoconservatism is based on peace through strength. Critics find it to be an ideology closely related to war hawks. Not only that, but any sense of radical political ideologies are also of heavy disdain for neocons. Progressivism. I associate progressivism with my favorite president of all time, Theodore Roosevelt. It is the idea of social reform, and follows science, technology, and economic development. Progressives became prominent in the early 20th century, and they sought to break up big companies and prevent monopolies, while also being major advocates for conservationism. Nowadays, progressives want to mitigate income inequality and reform healthcare and Wall Street within the United States. Nationalism. the promotion of one's own nation and support for its interests. It is the idea of self-governance, and the goal of building the country's self-determination. Nationalists don't really like outside interference, believing that the nation should be one of shared characteristics between people. It can be a positive or negative aspect of a country. It really depends on the ideals the country tries to impose on the people of the nation. Libertarianism. I mean, it's in the name. It's a philosophy all about liberty. It is the freedom of choice and being individualistic. They're skeptical of government and state power, and I mean, who wouldn't be? Libertarians define themselves by using the non-aggression principle, which is the opposition of using force to achieve social or political goals. Marxism and Leninism. A communist ideology adopted by the Soviet Union throughout much of the 20th century, a combination of Marxist and Leninist ideas, it rejects the idea of a global communist revolution, instead opting in for a slow transition from capitalism to socialism to then communism. It was really a twist on Karl Marx's beliefs, but as it applied to Russia. Monarchism. Yep, it's good to be king. Essentially, a person who is known as the monarch is the head of state. It can be a symbolic or autocratic ideology, and expands upon many ranges and labels. Succession of the monarch is usually hereditary, but a person can also be elected into it. This type of ideology went out of style in much of the Western world in replacement with republics, but still holds a place in other countries such as Great Britain. Stalinism. Yeah, Joseph Stalin thought of himself as a pretty big deal. An ideology based on a cult of personality, it is a one-party totalitarian police state. Scholars label Stalinism as a period of a reign of terror. And I know I said I would try to keep this fairly balanced, but honestly I can agree. It was subject to a command economy, and in order to industrialize the Soviet Union into the modern era, was brutal in its methods. Stalin would state that he was upholding the legacy of Vladimir Lenin, but in reality was leading his entire nation to suffrage. Anarcho-Capitalism. Now we're getting into the interesting labels. Essentially, mix anarchy with capitalism as the name suggests. The ideology states that there should be no state, that the free market will be able to ensure liberty for all individuals. Trade is voluntary in this instance, with money, goods, and land being transferred dependent on the individual. Trotskyism. Leon Trotsky was an enemy of Joseph Stalin and was a pure idealist of communism. Critical of Stalinism and the idea of socialism in one country, Trotskyism advertises the theory of a permanent revolution. That is, pursuing the interests of communism independently, without any compromise with opposing ideologies. It is a worldwide revolution of socialism led by the proletariat, rather than it being in one country. Bonapartism. Man, we as human beings really love to fascinate about sole individuals, don't we? Essentially, it's authoritarian rule by a popular figure made leader by a mandate. It's called Bonapartism because Napoleon Bonaparte was really popular to the French people during his reign. National Bolshevism. A combination of fascist and Bolshevik ideals, it is economically far left and culturally far right. Essentially, it's a socialist economy and a strong centralized state. Critics pass this theory as a joke, but I've seen people who take this ideology seriously. To me, it's synonymous with the Knots Bowl gang. National Anarchism. Essentially, the promotion of these ideals is to replace the state with small societies to ensure racial separation. It is a far-right movement that doesn't like the government. Anarcho Communism. The belief that there should be no hierarchies, money or social class, and that the means of production be inherited by the people. Decisions are made by the people, not representatives. There's so many versions of anarchy that I hope I don't have to cover them anymore following this one. Anarcho Permatism. God damn it! Okay, so essentially it's the rejection of the state once again, but even beyond that, with a yearning to return to a pre-civilized way of life, with deindustrialization and an abolition of modern-day society. Think of cavemen. There, you got it? Good, let's move on. Pinochetism. Based on the former president of Chile, Augusto Pinochet, it's essentially the silenced liberal meme, rejecting economic leftism in place of a right-wing culture, and a right-wing market. Pinochet was so opposed to leftists that he would have those in opposition sent onto helicopters, and then thrown off of them into the ocean or high peaks of the Andes Mountains, and have them killed. I mention this because while researching this topic, this was used as a meme by those of this shared ideology. How terrifying. Transhumanism. Okay, I don't know if I would even count this as a political ideology. Essentially, it's the enhancement of the human condition with technology. Looking up pictures for this made me think about the movie I, Robot, featuring Will Smith. Is this truly the future we want? Well, it'll probably occur by the end of my lifetime, in some way or another. Hulpatism. Okay, things are getting a little crazy. Hulpatism is the philosophy of Cambodian revolutionary Pol Pot, one inspired by Marxism and Leninism. In order to reach communism, Pol Pot decided to follow Marx's theory of history and commit to socialism first. He relocated workers from urban populations and sent them to work on farms. In order to reach true equality, he abolished money and the people of Cambodia were forced to wear all black clothing. In the vein of Lenin, Pol Pot crafted communism to the way he sought it to be in Cambodia, in hopes of creating a self-sufficient agrarian society. Okay, so I can't say this word because YouTube would have a potential target on my back, so I'll just call it something else, I guess? How about Stashism? Because of this guy's mustache? Yeah, that works. Stashism is an extremely authoritarian philosophy most prominent in Germany following the fall of the Weimar Republic. It discourages liberal democracy and the parliamentary system, and instead advertises scientific racism and eugenics to support its foundings on anti-Semitism. It is incredibly nationalistic and absolutely despises communism. It is far-right in its politics and believes that superior people should dominate other people. It values dictatorial power and the forcible suppression of any opposition. The authority and rule is centralized in the government, with an economic system focused on social regimentation. Anarcho-nihilism. Enough with the anarchy. Essentially, it's a rejection of the state, but also that life sucks and is meaningless. It is the epitome of the black pill. The idea is that the state has no grounding on reality. We get it. You live in a society. Queer anarchism. The only way to be queer and truly liberated is to reject the hierarchy and state and to abolish any form of discrimination whatsoever. It is culturally and economically left-wing. Illegalism. It is the embracement of all forms of crime whatsoever, and that's essentially it. I like the character to this ideology as it's literally just Al Capone. Libertarian socialism, also referred to as Anarcho-Socialism. Oh, that's great. That's absolutely fantastic. I'm too far into the script already, so I hope you've enjoyed me talking about all the forms of anarchy. You would think this would be an oxymoron, but who am I to judge? Essentially, the ideology advocates for freedom, but also wants the government to be cooperative and in helping its people. In layman's terms, don't bother me unless I want help. Jihadism. Whoa, so this is a hard one to explain because there's no clear meaning to it, but to make it somewhat distinct, it is applied to insurgent Islamic movements that are radical. It sees aggressive struggle and violence as a necessity to restore God's rule on Earth. This one is dangerous. Corporate Buddhism. Okay, so let's try and look this up. Will somebody please explain to me what f***ing corporate Buddhism is supposed to be? User helpful_Hank says if corporations are people, and people have no self, then do corporations have a self? Yeah, let's just move on to the next segment. I'm not even going to try and wrap my head around this one. If you've made it this far, I just want to thank you. We're about to enter some meme ideologies, and even some darker real ones, but before that, let me just mention a couple of my favorite joke ideologies. Here's a good one. The flag of the National Socialist German Workers, Pringles. Wow, just wow. Pasadism Communalism. We'll get into Pasadism in a bit, but I just wanted to shout out how wicked this flag is. Let's continue on, shall we? Radical Centrism. You've heard of centrism. Now try radical centrism for size. Borrowing ideas from the left and the right, it calls for a fundamental reform to institutions, stating that all ideologies have good ideas and that it is up to the state to pluck from whatever those ideas are. Yeah, it's fairly broad. Kahanism. It is an inherently Jewish ideology in which it features the idea that a majority of Arabs who live in Israel are enemies. It's a Jewish state where only Jews make the decisions. The ideological party has been banned from Israel due to its radical ideas and various forms of violent action against Palestinians. Anarcho-Nazbol. What the hell does this even mean?
And, why don't you tell us what this means, son?
I'm glad you asked, Dad. You see, Nazbol stands for National Bolshevik. It's a party that combines the economic system of the communists with the, let's say, cultural policy of the Nazis.
And what's this anarcho all about?
Mom, everyone knows that the government is lame nowadays. That's why I'm a National Bolshevik that doesn't believe in a state. Anarcho-Nazbol.
Yeah, what J-Rex said. Eco-fascism. So imagine elements of Stashism, but they really like nature. That's right, conservationism is at the head of this ideology. Also, people who are eco-fascists blame climate change on other races and tend to make it a culture thing. Anarcho Monarchism. I swear the term anarcho is just thrown around without anyone knowing what it actually means. Essentially, imagine a monarchy, but it's running under a stateless society. It borrows a page from Huey Long and exclaims that every man should literally be a king. I appreciate the reference. We've reached the bottom. Accelerationism. To accelerate capitalism and technology into a rapid change. Whether or not these changes are positive or negative is dependent on its intentions. In a negative sense, this rapid process is intended to trigger revolt against the system, or to even radicalize people in a particular thought. It's divided into left and right-wing leaning variants that can be extreme. In ways, accelerationism may be used to encourage a societal collapse due to frustrations surrounding accelerated capitalism. Pasadism. This is probably my favorite one on the list. Not because I agree with it, but because it's hilarious to me. So it's an authoritarian left ideology that suggests that socialism can only be achieved following the ruins of a global nuclear war. A form of accelerationism, it's very unorthodox in its views. Somehow, ufology got meshed into this theory with them believing that socialist aliens from outer space will help rebuild the Earth following the collapse of society and will provide the tools to create a socialist revolution. Yeah. Furthermore, the ideology believes that eventually we will be able to communicate with dolphins. You know, at least I'm not talking about some random form of anarchism anymore. Esoteric Stashism. This is madness. So imagine Stashism, but it's spiritual and views the ideology through a mystical lens. It has subgroups who label themselves as either paganists, Hindu, or any other esoteric religion. Essentially, they believe that the Aryan race is descended from gods, or even aliens. And off over here was the literal reincarnation of God. Wow. And I'm not even mentioning the Stashist UFOs. Ingsoc. You guys like the book 1984? Yeah, well, essentially it's the ideology of the party in George Orwell's book. It is so far authoritarian that it would be off the political compass. That's how bad we're talking over here. Hive mind collectivism. It is so far left. It wants society to be assimilated into a collective conscious. There's no money, there's no sense of liberty. There is just one hive mind in which everyone is connected to. Circulus. This is disgusting. Essentially, it's left in nature and revolves around literal human waste. It wants humans to use their waste as a collection of state tax and to be reused as fertilizer to further agriculture. Yeah, guys, I'm done. I can only imagine it gets weirder than this iceberg, but I can't do this anymore. However, if you really want me to cover more, make sure to show support for this video and subscribe. Before we wrap up this video, a special thanks to Lilith, also known as @ManipulatorGod, for editing most of this video. She did a great job. Follow her on Twitter if you want to see a true descent into madness. Love you all, and have a nice day. Zeep is out.